Early childhood education. All the cool kids are talking about early childhood education these days. It is totally the hot topic. So the chances that you're going to be able to go, for instance, the next 18 months without hearing the concept of early childhood education being discussed probably at length in the public forum, it's hard to imagine. It's definitely an in-style thing for people to be talking about these days. And here's a New York Times article just from a little over a year ago that's saying preschool is having its moment as a favorite cause for politicians and interest groups who ordinarily have trouble agreeing on the time of day, which is pretty much true. Like, everybody's on board with early childhood education is a good idea. There might be fights over should we fund Head Start or whatever, but the idea of early childhood education is one that really has captured sort of pretty much both sides of the political spectrum. From my perspective, though, one of the things that's great about that is that unlike a lot of other political discourse, this piece of it is really very strongly driven by research evidence. So as it says here, with a growing body of research pointing to the importance of early childhood development and its effect on later academic and social progress, blah, blah, blah. This is really very much a research-based point that early childhood education works. So things that you would have heard about that back that up are things like Perry Preschool. So for those of you who don't know, Perry Preschool is a very extensive preschool program that was evaluated experimentally, so a control and treatment group, in the 1960s, where the kids from the treatment group got, just a tremendous amount of services and ended up doing better than the control group kids, not just when they were in preschool, but for the rest of their lives. Okay, so Perry Preschool is one example of where we have evidence that early childhood education worked and persisted for a long time. Head Start is another example. Head Start also is a program that started in the 1960s. A lot of evaluation has been done on it. Definitely strong evidence of effects in the short term. A little bit more controversial, but probably the weight of the evidence still also suggests long-term effects from Head Start as well. So even by the point of adulthood, people in Head Start programs probably did better than children not in those programs, all for disadvantaged children. Just the last one I want to give you as an example, there's this thing called Project STAR, which for those of you who are in my 103 class, we actually played with the Project STAR data. And those data, that's an experiment that was conducted looking at class size reduction, where students were randomly assigned to classes where some of them, the treatment group were in smaller classes than the control group. And then they went from there. And so the kids did better on test scores, they did better later in life. And again, so you see this intervention that we're going to do something to help out disadvantaged kids by providing them with better education at earlier ages, and it seems like those things seem like they work, they have an effect. The thing that's amazing about all of that is taking into context all of these programs, Head Start, there's other ones on Universal Pre-K, Perry Preschool, is that the biggest one, the one has never really been, to some extent has not been fully evaluated, is Sesame Street. So Sesame Street, On Time magazine has covered Sesame Street's TV's Gift to Children. This is from November. This is a year after the show started. It would become so successful the year after it started that it made it onto the cover of Time magazine. It is hard to understate what a big deal Sesame Street was when it first launched. On average, so think about this. So Perry Preschool had 60 kids or so in the treatment group classes. Those are the most studied 60 kids ever in the face of the universe. Okay? 60 kids are in Head Start. Project STAR, there are maybe a few thousand participants in that. In Head Start, there's maybe even Head Start's a big program. You might get, back at the time, a few 100,000 participants in a Head Start program. 5 million people watched a typical episode of Sesame Street. So it was huge as an intervention. Not only was it huge, 5 million people watching a typical episode, but it cost nothing. $5, this is in today's dollars, $5 per viewer per year. 5. Perry Preschool costs about $20,000. Head Start costs about $7,000 or $8,000. In today's dollars, $5. Is Ben Hammond here? No, Ben's not here. Because basically this is, from a college's perspective, which is different obviously than early childhood, but we're talking the holy grail here. Right? This is like what we're after, is finding ways that we can scale up to have these huge numbers of people watching our educational content at pennies on the dollar and having it have an effect. Right? That's what we're looking. That's this whole MOOC thing, right? Massive online courses, massively open online courses. Sesame Street was the first MOOC. It was doing exactly what we're trying to replicate now at the level of higher education. Okay? But let me sort of document a little bit like the importance that Sesame Street had when it was initially launched. So here's an article from the New York Times, July 31st, 1970. So again, this is like 8 months after the show started. A study conducted in several communities across the country indicates that 90% of the 3 to 5-year-olds and families with annual incomes under $5,000 or less watch the educational television program Sesame Street. Who said that in the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, 60% watch the show every single day. It is hard to imagine in a modern day context how you can have such a universal intervention that's designed to improve children's outcomes. It was also highly regarded, not just as an entertainment show, but also one that was providing educational content, and educational content that worked. So again, here's a New York Times article from November, about a year after the show started. Sesame Street rated excellent. 2-year study finds it helped children of the poor learn. Okay? And then look at this. Data. Data are a good thing. Right, I stumbled over there. I was going to say this. Okay, so here's the evidence that they were showing, and basically what this study is doing is taking the kids who watch Sesame Street more and comparing them to the kids who watch Sesame Street less, and it turned out that the kids who watch Sesame Street more did better than the kids who watch Sesame Street less. I'm going to argue in a little while that this is probably not the best way to do social science research, and that, maybe we shouldn't be taking this result so literally. On the other hand, I will talk about sort of better evidence that was presented at that time that makes exactly that point. Okay? Sesame Street really worked. Kids who watched Sesame Street did better on test scores when they watched it. Here's a cartoon from the New Yorker. Why isn't that child at home watching Sesame Street? So it clearly had made it into popular culture that Sesame Street was a show that was popular and it was a show that worked. Right? So this is a weird thing, right? Because basically, if you were back in the 1960s, where sort of many women were not working, taking care of their children, if you didn't let your kids watch Sesame Street, you were a bad mother, right? If you wanted to be a good mother, you had to let your kids watch TV. The question, though, is what's going to happen to these kids? So we have this intervention. We know that it worked immediately. What happens to the kids as they get older? Right? So the question is what happens. So the issue is what you kind of want to do is you want to track the kids. Right? Tracking the kids is something that you guys are reasonably familiar with in terms of some aspects of popular culture. So there was the movie Boyhood that was out last year, which starts off with a kid and tracks the kid and look how interesting it is how the kid evolved, right? That's kind of what we want to know. This is not the greatest example because it was fiction, it's just one kid, blah blah blah, but it's the one that you definitely know. The better example is this movie called 56 Up. How many people know the 7 Up series? Oh, look at that. Okay. We got the PBS crowd here. So 56 Up is the 8th installment of this series. So it says up there in little print that you can't read. In 1964, a group of 7-year-old children were interviewed by the documentary 7 Up. They've been filmed every 7 years since. Now they're 56. Okay, so this is in 2013, I think. So they're born. This is a cohort of children born in 1957 that have been tracked their entire lives, and every 7 years they make a movie about them showing how their lives have changed. Okay? So this notion of tracking people over time and seeing how they've developed over the years is something that you're totally comfortable with, right? Because you've seen it before. All I want to do in this paper is exactly the same thing. So what I'm going to do in this paper is to think about what was the impact of Sesame Street on the cohort of children who were born at the time that Sesame Street was introduced, and I'm just going to track them over their lives and see how well they've been doing. Okay? And the outcomes that I want to look at, we're going to basically, like I said, it's going to be a life cycle thing. So we're going to start off at younger ages. And first thing, obviously, I want to document the fact, which I have already reported to you, the test scores at the time improved. Immediate, instantaneous test scores improved. I want to look at something which is called grade for age status, which is a measure many of you may not have seen before, but the idea is pretty intuitive. So basically, the idea is, are you at the right grade level for your age? So if you start school in first grade at age 6, that's when you're supposed to start school, and that means that by age 10, 4 years later, you should be in 4th grade. If you're not, you're behind grade level, and you haven't satisfied grade for age. You are grade for age if you were at 4th grade 4 years later. Okay? So basically, what this is measuring is, are you progressing normally through the educational system? Okay, so that's a measure of a good educational outcome. Okay? So that's going to take the kids a little bit further along, sort of into, by the data I'm going to be using, I'll be sort of tracking them through middle school and early high school. And we can see how they're doing then. Are they at the appropriate grade level? And then we can actually take them into adulthood. Because this is a long time ago. These people are old. Like, my age. And we can look at what happened, by the time they were done getting their education. How much schooling did they get? And then how are they doing in the labor market? So all of those things are what we're going to be looking at in this paper. Now, how am I going to do that? It turns out that there's a lot of information in this picture, and some of it is even going to sort of motivate the methods that we're going to be using to answer those questions. So there's a few things that I want to comment about this picture. The first one, I think it's really, really hard to look at this picture and not comment on the woman's hair. I mean, like you're looking at it like it's like, whoa. I mean, seriously. Okay, but we're all adults, we can get past that. But the two sort of substantive points that I want to make that come from this picture, the first thing has to do with the price of this TV. So for those of you who are old enough to recognize TVs like this, even in 1969, by 1969 standards, this was not a nice television set. Okay, so if you can't read the print there, but this is a 12-inch portable. You can tell it's portable because it's on the stand. It's actually portable means the stand has wheels. It really weighs too much to carry. This is not a nice TV set, but it is a new TV set. This is a 1969 advertisement, by the way. I got it from a source online for 1969. Okay, so it's like a mediocre television set in 1969 for $249. You can go to Best Buy right now and totally get a, you can't get an 80-inch flat screen, right? But you can get a decent TV set for $249. Okay? So, in some sense, TV sets in terms of the dollars don't cost a lot different now as they did then, but we make a lot more money now, right? So median family income during this period was something like $6,000 or $7,000 a year. Right? So we're making close to 10 times that now, right? So this TV set is essentially 10 times more expensive then than it would be today. Right? TVs were very expensive, and that's going to be a big deal a little bit later on in the talk. Okay? The second thing, let's see. I want some of the younger people to answer this question. Who knows the difference? I know you know. What's the difference? Anyone know the difference between these two dials? Right, I want the young people. Come on. Go ahead, Jess.
Channel and volume? I don't know.
Well, you're close. Do you use them for, like, if you press this button like some Russian satellite? No. So, Cam, tell us what this is.
I don't remember.
You don't? This is how you change the channel on the television set. There was no remote control, right? You change the channel this way, right? Except there's two of them. So why are there two of them? Come on, Alan.
UHF, VHF.
This is the VHF station. These are VHF stations, and these are UHF stations. The VHF stations, these are channels to, the young kids are looking at me like, what the hell is he talking about?
Is it like AM, FM? Like on the radio?
It's kind of like AM. guys don't know anything. How did you get accepted to Wellesley College? Jen?
Radio test was off.
Anyway, VHF were channels 2 through 13, and UHF are channels 14 to I think 78 was the highest UHF channel. Now, for the old timers in the room, which channel would you rather be watching? VHF channels are way better than UHF channels. The reception's way better on a VHF channel than a UHF channel. So if you wanted to watch something on VHF, you probably could see it, and if you wanted to watch something on UHF, maybe you could and maybe you couldn't. Okay? That VHF, UHF thing is going to be a huge deal a little bit later on in the paper. Okay? So remember that. So what do we find? Let's give you a preview of the results. So what we find is that Sesame Street is capable of improving childhood outcomes. So the kids who were initially exposed to Sesame Street when it was first introduced in 1969 actually did do better in terms of their test scores right away and in terms of their progression through the educational systems. They're more likely to remain grade for age as they got a little bit older. Not only that, and this is important for the relative to the purpose of the show, which I'll talk about a little bit later, it turns out that the effects are much bigger in areas where the kids who were watching were in disadvantaged areas. So if you were starting from economic disadvantage and we exposed you to the show, the growth in terms of your educational performance would be bigger. Okay? And that's a good thing. On the other hand, as we continue further longer in their lives, it turns out that the fact that you observe, through sort of teenage years or something like that, eventually fades and goes away. So that by the time we get to the end of your educational experience, we don't see any difference in ultimate educational attainment or in terms of labor market outcomes, like are you working or wages. Okay. So let's get started. All right. As we documented here very clearly a couple minutes ago, there's some history lessons that are going to need to be provided in order to get people up to speed on what it is that we're doing. And so the first thing I want to do is spend a little time talking about history in terms of TV in the preschool environment. So I know that, Sesame Street started in 1969. I'll say that about 5 times the next half hour or whatever. I know that was a long time ago, and I know that, fire was invented just a few years before that. But despite the fact that it was that long ago, and it was still 3 miles to school uphill both ways, it turns out that 95% of households, even in 1969, owned TV sets. Okay? So for the most part, television exposure was universal by 1969. The real difference was less about having a TV than what you could watch on the TV, because there weren't 500 channels back then. There were essentially 3 channels. So ABC, NBC, and CBS are sort of the main broadcast networks. For the most part, that's what you got. There's probably a PBS channel as well. But beyond that, the amount of television stations broadcasting at that time was very limited. If you grew up in New York, you'd get WPIX. If you grew up in Chicago, you would get WGN. Those were independent stations, and basically what the independent stations showed were the reruns from the networks. Right? So there wasn't a lot in terms of television content at the time besides what was on those 3 stations, and that's sort of an important fact, because basically there weren't a lot of options out there for people to watch. Okay? Cable TV, which I know basically almost all of you at this point are getting your TV either streaming or from cable, that just basically wasn't a thing in 1969. The cable TV market was really in its infancy, and really what it was trying to do was less about providing people with 500 stations, but taking people who live in sort of more remote places that had difficulty getting television reception, providing them with like the TVA for television, basically. So 6% of households had cable TV, and that was not a big deal. So I'm just going to ignore that sort of programming. Okay. The other thing which I wanted, so the next question becomes, well, what were kids getting otherwise in terms of educational content? So maybe they were watching Reading Rainbow or something like that on TV instead. It turns out that, or what were they doing school-wise? That's what these next 2 points are trying to get at. It turns out that really there was very little going on in a little kid's life back then that would be considered educational before they got to school. Okay? So for other children's programming, I did this very sophisticated thing. where I typed in Google popular children's television shows in the 1960s. And this is the list. I'm not exactly saying that this is scientific or anything like that. But Captain Kangaroo, which had really no educational content. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood had educational content, but it was more like being nice to others. Kind of content. Like, didn't teach you your letters or anything. Romper Room is a locally produced show, which I remember being awful. Cartoons were on. I loved the Jetsons, the Flintstones not so much. And then kids would watch sitcoms too at the time, so the Andy Griffith Show, and then for the young people in the audience, who was the little kid on the Andy Griffith Show? Oh, good for the old people answer. All right, so they weren't getting any educational content in terms of television. And they really weren't getting it in terms of preschool either. Preschool was very uncommon back then. So from the 1970 census, what I see is that 9% of 3-year-olds are in preschool, 19% of 4-year-olds are in preschool, and just a little bit more than half of 5-year-olds are in kindergarten, like in the country, right? And this is the ones who are in kindergarten. There was no debates about like full day kindergarten, blah blah blah. This was half day, right? So the point of this is that Sesame Street was really a novelty in the sense that it was a way that you could communicate educational content to preschool-age kids in ways that they were absolutely not getting before that. Okay? And the other thing which I want to make, this is also a young people comment, is that, so this thing called academic redshirting was rare at the time. What's academic redshirting? Well, you know how, if you want to get into the best prep school, you got to hold your kid back so that they start school at age 7 instead of age 6, right? Like, you guys have all heard of this before? Like, that's like a thing now. It was not a thing then. And the reason why that matters is because now, if you were age 7 and just starting first grade, we would consider that to be a good thing. Back then, if you were age 7 just starting first grade, that would be considered a bad thing. You were held back because things weren't going well for you, not because you were trying to get ahead. Okay? All right. More history. History of Sesame Street. Actually, the history of Sesame Street is pretty interesting in the sense that it follows exactly in the same philosophical vein as Perry Preschool and Head Start. It all came from the same place. It turned out that, I know there's developmental psychologists around who know this stuff way better than I do, but it would appear that as late as the 1950s, mostly what people thought about in terms of childhood development was it was all heredity. Right? In some sense, there was really nothing that you could do to a little kid that was going to help them do better. And apparently in the late 50s and into the early 60s, in this book by Hunt, it was apparently a seminal one, sort of changed that way of thinking. And it became sort of more conventional wisdom to think that actually maybe we can intervene in the life of a little kid and have them do better as a result of that. So this is 1961, and that's why you see Head Start is starting in 1966. Perry Preschool was about the same time. Sesame Street was initially proposed in 1967, so this is all happening at the same time. It's sort of all about this sort of movement that's taking place within the field of developmental psychology. And the show was specifically developed by educators and developmental psychologists trying to accomplish exactly this goal of improving educational outcomes, particularly for disadvantaged children. I have my Marco Rubio Now, the goal of the show was clearly designed to improve school readiness. So by the time the kids got to first grade, they would be ready to learn. And so that was particularly important for poor and minority children at the time. The show very much emphasized academic content. It's not that it didn't have other content in it. There were other things that children were supposed to learn from, but the focus of the show clearly was designed for academic content. You were supposed to learn, your letters, your numbers, colors, all those sorts of things. First episode was November 10th, 1969. Importantly, the show aired in most places in the morning and in the afternoon. And why that's important is because for the kids, for instance, who were in kindergarten in the morning, they could still watch it in the afternoon when they got home. If you lived in, is anybody around who lived in New York City back then? This show was on 6 times a day in New York City. Okay? It was on constantly. The ratings were just ridiculous relative to anything that we can think of in the present context. So among 2 to 5-year-olds, a third of them watched a typical episode. And what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes is that a third of them watched it, but only two-thirds of them had access to the show. Only two-thirds of them could watch it, and a third of them were watching. So half of the eligible people were watching the show. Every kid was watching Sesame Street. If you think about what those ratings are like in today's context, like the Super Bowl gets ratings of about 100 million people for 300 million in the population, so about a third. Right? This is the Super Bowl for little kids every single day. The nachos were just out of control. Now, who watches Mad Men? How many people watched it on Sunday night? Did you see the Sesame Street reference on Sunday night? No, so nobody even noticed. I was sitting there watching it next to my wife, and like the scene comes on. This scene right here, where this little kid, that's Joan over there. This is Joan's kid. Is watching Sesame Street, is playing and watching TV, and all of a sudden the Sesame Street theme song comes on very quietly in the background. I start hitting Heidi. Oh my God, I can't believe. She's like, what is wrong with you? Which she does actually. Quite a lot. So what was amazing to me when I was watching this is like actually how historically accurate this show was, because there was something earlier in the show that indicated that this episode took place in January of 1970, 2 months after the show started. And he's watching Sesame Street. And the other thing which I want to point out to you, which is also going to be relevant for later, is the TV set that the kid is watching the show on. Notice how it only has one dial? Rob's, there's only, I'll tell you, just the one dial. We'll talk about why there's only one dial on the TV in a few minutes. Anyways, okay, that was fun. All right, so what did we do? All right, here's the correlation and causation thing. Now it's time for the statistics lecture. When you teach statistics, or like when you do statistics for a living, this correlation and causation thing, it's a pretty big deal. So pretty much like every time you, view the world, you're always thinking about things in terms of correlation and causation. My poor son, Jake, whose bedroom is right next to my office, every time I'd see something that annoyed me because it was in the press about correlation and causation, I'd scream into his room, Jake, what's wrong with this? And he had if he didn't answer within a minute, I'd get really annoyed. But just to give it, if anyone who's ever taken a statistics class knows that correlation is not causation. It's a great philosophical thing for people to remember. To actually implement it in terms of the way they view the world is a lot more difficult, and it happens constantly. People make the mistake. So here's an example. This was just recently in the news. Happy eating, ingredient to a long life in your cereal bowls. The article was about if you eat breakfast cereal that has high fiber content, you're going to live longer. And the way that they could tell that is because they observed people's eating habits, and then they saw how long they lived, and the people who had more fiber in their diet and their breakfast cereal lived longer. You could easily imagine that probably people who are eating fiber cereal for breakfast, because it doesn't taste good, they're doing it because they're sort of health conscious, and so perhaps it's not really all that surprising that they're living longer. So this is an extremely common mistake, and one that we need to sort of do everything in our power to fix whenever we see it. So how do we do that? You can't, in terms of thinking about Sesame Street, you can't just compare national trends over time. You can't say, well, 1969 Sesame Street started and kids' test scores started going up or down or whatever. That's just a correlation. The other, that one's probably obvious. The other one that you can't do, though, is you also can't compare viewers and non-viewers. You can't just take a sample of viewers and a sample of non-viewers and say, oh, look, the viewers did better on their test than the non-viewers. The kids who were watching the show probably are a little bit more, or the families are probably a little bit more engaged in the whole educational exercise. And so perhaps it's not really all that surprising that they do well. This is what's wrong with that first slide that I showed you much earlier on, and the one from the New York Times about the people who viewed the show, watched the show more, did better on test scores. Right? Can't do that. So how do you fix the problem? The best way to fix the problem, of course, is by doing what we call the gold standard, is by implementing an experimental design. Right? So you guys all understand experimental designs. That's how you test drugs. You've got a random assignment, control group, treatment group. You give the treatment group the drug. The control group doesn't get it. If the treatment group survives longer, the drug works. Right? And random assignment is critical in that, because basically what random assignment does is it generates control and treatment groups that are identical in every dimension except for the drug. Okay? Now actually, it turns out that you can do experiments on things like TV shows, and if someone wants to ask me later, I can talk about it. But like, there are experiments like this going on now, where it's like you have a new TV show and you sort of, control treatment, let them watch, don't watch, right? But when Sesame Street was started, they didn't quite do that, or they kind of did, and I'll talk about that in a little while too. But so if you don't have that available, the question becomes, what do you do instead, right? Because it's still an interesting question. You want to know the causal effect, but you don't have an experiment. So I want to talk about one alternative approach to doing that, which is something that we sometimes call a natural experiment or a quasi-experiment. I'm going to use the concept of the language of a natural experiment. And basically what we want to do here is think about, something occurs, there's some naturally occurring division of people that makes them divide up into control groups and treatment groups. For some, there's some random event that takes place which just happens to affect the treatment group and not the control group. And then we can look for changes over time. If you happen to have been in the treatment, did things change for you relative to what they would have been otherwise? So just to give you a concrete example of, from some work that I've done in the past in terms of abortion legalization. So abortion was legalized in New York and California. So everyone knows Roe v. Wade was 1973. But New York and California legalized abortion in 1970. Okay? One was through a constitutional a judicial decision in the state of California, and the other was through legislation in the state of New York. So you have a control group and a treatment group in the sense that now California and New York represent treatment groups. They got treated by abortion access. The control group, nothing changed for them. If you lived in Nebraska, you couldn't get an abortion like the whole time. Right? So what we're looking for then is it the case that in California and New York, after the law changed, births changed relative to what happened elsewhere? So we can represent that in a picture that looks something like this. So, we recognize, so we're going to measure time on the x-axis. This is like, 1965 to 1975 or something like that, right? And, New York and California may have different birth rates relative to the other states, even in the 60s. And then all of a sudden you get to the law change in 1970, and actually this is reversed in the sense that if you think about it, so what we would predict would be births should fall in New York and California relative to the rest of the country, so you get a downward shift. But you get this shift, and that shift is the treatment effect. Okay? And that's a way that we can evaluate a causal effect in an instance where we don't have random assignment. It's not a true experiment. Okay? What I want to do is to argue that the introduction of Sesame Street also presents the opportunity to evaluate a natural experiment. So what's the natural experiment that we have here? It turns out that when the show was first started, only 2/3 of households could actually watch Sesame Street when the show was introduced because their TV couldn't receive the signal. Okay? So for a third of the country, their TVs couldn't receive the signal. Why couldn't their TVs receive the signal? Well, the first way is just sort of the easiest way to think about it. They lived so basically this is the old world, like the way that you got TV was, the radio, the TV wave signals, the radio waves, and there's a tower, it's broadcasting the signals, it had to be received by your TV. That's how you watch TV, there was no cable. Okay? If you lived too far away from the tower, you were not going to get the signal. Okay? Nothing all that really complicated about that. The second problem, though, is a little bit more difficult. The second problem is that Sesame Street, as you all know, mainly aired on PBS channels. PBS channels often, although not exclusively, but often are on UHF channels. UHF channels are bad in the black and white version of the world. VHF good, UHF bad. PBS was often broadcast on UHF channels that had very poor reception. So if you happen to be living in a place where the PBS channel is broadcasting over UHF, there was a good chance you weren't going to be able to receive that signal. Now, why couldn't you receive the signal? First of all, there's the physics of it, because UHF signals are not as good as VHF signals. In terms, they bounce off of buildings. They can't sort of go around the buildings. Like the building kills the signal. Right? Right. Yes. VHF signals are a little bit more flexible and can do things like bounce and go around. So there's the physics of it, which says VHF is better than UHF, but there's also the policy of it that makes VHF better than UHF. What's the policy aspect? It turns out that all of these stations were assigned channels on VHF or UHF, where in the spectrum they got to broadcast, based on FCC decisions that were made in the 1950s, which had to do with like a whole bunch of other stuff, mostly about interference between stations across locations. So the thing is that TVs at the time did not at all have UHF tuners. So think about what happened. So TVs don't have UHF tuners. The FCC approves a new station in UHF. It's sending signals, but nobody can receive them. And if you're sending signals that nobody can receive, you can imagine people who make TV shows probably aren't so interested in having their shows broadcast over channels that can't be received. So there's no content. Because there's no content, nobody cared that they didn't have the UHF signals, the receivers. So for a very long period of time, there was what we call in economics a poor equilibrium, where sort of there was UHF, but it wasn't really very effective. So in 1964, the federal government realized that this was a problem and tried to fix it, and required all new TV sets to have UHF tuners as of 1964. Okay? Now, so what does that tell you, by the way, about Jones' TV set from Mad Men? That TV was earlier than 1964. It only had one dial on it. That was a VHF-only TV set. So Jones seems like she's got a better job. She can afford a new TV. Right? If the TV set was built before 1964, it probably only had one dial on it and could not receive a UHF signal at all. Okay? After 1964, they started to spread these UHF tuners, but TVs were expensive, right? 10 times as expensive as they are today. So it took a really long time for that technology to disseminate. So by 1969, only 54% of households had a TV with a UHF tuner. Okay? So what do we have? We have people living in locations that are far away from towers. We have signals being broadcast over UHF, and the UHF signals are weak. And we have people without TV sets that can receive a UHF signal, and all of a sudden you now have this situation where 2/3 of the country can watch an episode and 1/3 of the country can't. That seems sort of pretty random in terms of how we're assigning people into these groups. It's just based on sort of the technology available at the time.
Was there no social class difference?
So the poor, so that's actually a big deal in this. Poor people obviously didn't. What we're going to be doing is you're going to see, I'm going to sort of skip past a lot of that part, but I'm not identified off of the poor versus the rich. It's going to be like distance to the tower, which is not going to be about income. So I'm going to have to skip past that, but it's been interesting. It's sort of a sophisticated. Anyways. All right, so what's the experiment? The experiment is that there's now sort of, remember, we're thinking about treatment and control groups. The treatment group, so before 1969, if you were growing up before 1969, nobody had access to Sesame Street. 1969 comes along. If you were in one of the locations where you could actually receive the signal well because it was on a VHF channel and you were relatively close to the tower, you could watch the show. You got treated. Right? The control group basically represents the other people who it's not a great control treatment because it's not like they had no reception, but they had a lot weaker reception. So this control treatment isn't like 0, 1, they got it or they didn't get it. It's about sort of gradations, right? So the treatment group got way better reception than the control group. Okay? So what we're looking for now is this is not time passing, but it's the year. It's about birth cohorts, right? This is about what age that you started first grade. Because if you're already past age 6, if you're already in 2nd grade when Sesame Street was introduced, it probably didn't do anything to you. It shouldn't have, right? So you needed to have been. So if you hit 1st grade before 1969, you're too old, right? So nothing should have happened to you. If you hit 1st grade after 1969, this makes you preschool age when Sesame Street started, and you have the ability to benefit from the show, but only if you got better reception. So I'm going to distinguish between people who had strong reception and weak reception, and whatever old difference used to exist, if Sesame Street worked, you should get an improvement in outcomes for the younger kids, for the preschool age kids in 1969, with the better reception. That's what we're looking to do. Now, so how do you get this reception data? Because we know places like who could watch and who couldn't watch. Well, it turned out that thanks to the wonders of the internet, I was able to locate this publication, television, I don't know if any of you have this on your bookshelf, but television fact book 1968, 1969 edition. There's a whole series of them. You may have, more than just the one. But this is actually the one that I needed because this is the time Sesame Street started. Basically for every station in the country, I have pictures that look like this, where you can see the little tower sticking up there, and then kind of like the map that's showing, reception rates, who could watch the signal from that station in the whole country. Okay? And the book is like that, so basically every station in the country essentially has something that looks like this. And if you put it all together, you get a picture that looks like this. Okay? So these are coverage rates. So coverage rates is the fraction of the population who can see the show, receive the broadcast, by county in 1969. And so not surprisingly, you see these clusters, right? So like basically there's a tower there, right? And then spreading out from the towers, the darker colors are better reception, right? And you sort of spread out, and the further away you go, the reception gets worse and worse and worse, right? That's distance. Distance clearly matters. And so it's not surprising that whatever the city center is, the tower's going to be near the city center, so you're going to get better reception near the city center. And so a lot of these things, like where these blotches are about, major metropolitan areas. Okay? It turns out that I'm never going to, no point of this exercise am I ever using rural areas. So this is not about urban rural. It's not about what's going on in, Wyoming or whatever. But even within urban areas, you'll see that there's definitely variation across places. So for instance, Southern California, really bad reception. The Washington, D.C. area had really bad reception. Like most of the Midwest, with the exception of that, which is Pittsburgh, has really bad reception. These are all very populated places, and they have really weak reception. This is less than 50% of the population can see the show. Okay? So why is that? So this picture, remember, so the gradations going out from the bubbles is about distance, and so what I want to argue next is the places where you see the holes are about VHF versus UHF. So this is a map of every TV station in the country that broadcast Sesame Street in 1969, with indicators for whether it was VHF or UHF. So VHF are the pins, and UHF are the dots. Okay? So look at Southern California. All UHF stations. Look at the Midwest. There's Pittsburgh with a VHF station, but otherwise everything else is UHF. Same thing, Washington, D.C. has a UHF channel. Okay? So now we have variation that can sort of set up our experiment. Right? So remember, the idea is that people who are too old when Sesame Street started shouldn't have been affected. And people who were preschool age in 1969, the ones in the good reception places should do better relative to the ones in the bad reception places. Which are, and the two factors that explain who's got good reception and bad reception is distance and UHF or VHF. Okay? And then so to go back to that 56 up version of the world, like we're going to track people through time, the government is nice enough to collect these data for us. So basically I'm going to use the 1980, 1990, and 2000 censuses, so 10 years apart. The great thing about the census is these are 5% samples of the whole country. I'm going to be focusing on kids born between 1959 and 1968, so which puts them at age 6 between 1965 and 1974. These are the preschool age kids. These are the ones who should be affected. These are the too old kids who shouldn't be affected. What's great about the census is it's huge, 5% of the country. Right? So just the fact that there's only 10 age groups, I still have something like 700,000 observations per census in my analysis. And we're just going to track them from census to census to census. So in 1980, they're sort of in their middle teens. By 1990, so that's why grade for age is a good outcome. So the outcomes that we're going to look at are grade for age. Remember, are you at the right grade level? 1990s educational attainment. So did you go to college, graduate from college, whatever. And in 2000, now you're sort of in your 30s, and I can measure ultimate labor. By now you're sort of in the labor force. And so that's what we're going to do. Okay? Now, so before I get to the actual results from what I did, I want to talk about the finding from the earlier studies. Remember, when Sesame Street was first introduced, people thought right away that it had a big effect. And I argued that that thing on the New York Times was probably not great evidence. This is great evidence, though, because the same people who did that study, so ETS are the people who did that study. Right? Those are you guys don't like, maybe those are the bad people. Yeah. Right, Jen? So they know what they're doing, though. They are very good statistically, right? So the problem was they didn't do the bad study on purpose. Basically, what they had intended to do was a real experiment. So they set up this experiment with people watching Sesame Street, where the idea of the experiment was they were going to take a bunch of kids, and then they were going to tell one group of them, hey guys, there's this really good show on, you should watch it, and then leave the other ones alone, thinking that the encouraged group would now watch Sesame Street a lot more, and the control group, you know, some of them would watch it, but probably not, right? And they just kind of missed just a little tiny bit on how popular the show was going to be. And so they went to do the experiment, and everybody in the control group had seen it too. Suddenly, you know, you don't really have an experiment, which is why they did the bad study in the first year. In the second year, they figured that out. So in the second year, they chose 2 locations in the country, both in poor neighborhoods. And they actually sort of using technological problems sort of very much in the same way that I am. So in Los Angeles, it was a UHF station in Los Angeles. They bought them UHF converters. So the treatment groups, they randomly assigned control treatment. The treatment group guys got converters and the control group didn't. And then they could do a real experiment. Okay? In Winston-Salem, cable TV, North Carolina, cable TV had just been introduced, and they did exactly the same thing. Poor people, it was not cheap, so the poor people weren't buying the cable TV. Unless you were in the treatment group, they bought it for you. Right? And so random assignment in the control and treatment group. Now we can just do a simple, just examine who did better on the test when they watched Sesame Street. And the treatment group did not just a little bit better, but a lot better. So it turns out that the results from these 2 experiments provide improvements in test scores that are about the same as what you would get from a Head Start intervention. So for $5 instead of $8,000. So the impact was similar to what you would get from Head Start. Okay, so that was their study. Now let's go to mine. Back to me. Okay, so let me just remind you what we're looking for. We're looking for pictures that look like this. So the older people, the kids who were too old, you know, there's some pre-existing difference, which doesn't really matter what it is, but then all of a sudden they get to the point when Sesame Street was introduced. The treatment group kids, because they got better reception, are going to do better, and the difference between them, the strong reception minus weak reception, the strong reception kids are going to improve their test scores relative to the weak reception kids, and we're going to jump up. Okay? We're looking for a pattern that looks like that. There you go. This is grade for age. Okay? So these are the kids who are too old. I normalized in this picture, so 1968 is forced to be equal to 0, the year before Sesame Street started. And all of a sudden you get to 1969 when Sesame Street started, and you get all big positive bars. Okay? Which very much looks like the picture. Very much looks like the picture it's supposed to look like. If you do exactly the same thing, but distinguish kids by whether they lived in poor areas or not poor areas. So the yellow bars here are the children. So children in counties with high high school dropout rates. Those are the poor counties. Right? Mm-hmm. Yellow are the poor places. Blue are the richer places. Okay, and it's exactly the yellow is exactly the same pattern. The blue not so much. It's a little bit difficult to tell, but if you look at the magnitude, you know where those bars are going are like 3% or something like that for the yellow bars. Oops. And in this one, it's more like 1.5 or 2%. So you're getting a much bigger effect in the disadvantaged areas than you got sort of, as a national average. Here's likelihood of being a high school graduate. Not so much. And here's the impact on hourly wages. This one, they're all positive towards the end. Like what I like to think, if you squint really hard and have a couple of drinks, you can see a treatment effect there. But the evidence isn't really all that strong. So, where does that leave us? So the first conclusion I would take away from this work is it is possible for students to benefit from electronically delivered educational content. So, Sesame Street did have an effect at earlier ages. And it did that for very small amounts of money. Right? Like basically pennies on the dollar from what you might expect to spend on other forms of interventions. On the other hand, what I think we want to get across with study is it's really important to think about long-term follow-ups. You can't just look at the instantaneous effects. Oh, look, their test scores went up, and assume that that accomplished your goal. Because the reason why we're doing a lot of these things in the first place is you're taking disadvantaged kids. You want them to become not disadvantaged, right? Which is about sort of lifelong earnings outcomes and employment and economic outcomes. We're not really getting that here. So it's really important to be thinking about doing these long-term follow-ups. The question then becomes why? Like, what's going on that's leading to these short-term effects, which actually are persisting? Like, it's occurring immediately when the kid is little, and persisting sort of for another 5 or 10 years afterwards, and then kind of is going away after that. At this point, basically, I can just really offer conjecture. I don't have actual evidence here, but you can think of a couple of different arguments. The first is that, like, I actually think that it's pretty amazing that you can get an effect like this in the first place, right? You are taking a 4-year-old kid and treating them once, and then never doing anything to them ever again. And even that somehow manages to give you this, 10-year improvement in their educational outcomes. I think that's pretty amazing. So clearly one argument you can make is that, well, maybe if we did it again, right? So maybe if there were sort of follow-up, interventions that occurred like this along the way to help improve academic performance, maybe that would be successful in sort of, perpetuating that effect. So that's one thing. The second thing is that, one of the things which we learned from some of the other interventions like Head Start is that maybe it's not completely about the cognitive component. Maybe it's not completely just about the learning how to read. Maybe some of it is about socio-emotional development. Maybe it's about like learning how to work hard and to play nicely with others and other sorts of things which you are not going to be able to get from a TV show. Certainly at the time, sort of more recent versions of Sesame Street do include more of this kind of content, but back at the time they really didn't have very much. And so incorporating this sort of a curriculum, within a more traditional educational environment with like a teacher present and other kids, which I think we would refer to as blended learning, maybe that's a better way to go. So like I said, this is just conjecture. I can't say that either of these things work or whether you would need to do both of them. But I do think this sheds some light on like what do we need to do to make these effects last longer. And then the last thing that I want to say is that I think it really is kind of amazing that given the extent of the intervention that we're talking about, and actually what I would argue is how interesting it is as an intervention, that this is just absolutely not on the radar screen of most people who are talking about public policy and early childhood education, and I think it should be.